Hello, everyone. This is Dwayne Monroe, one of the hosts, alongside R.C. Charles Roberts and Dennis Claxton of the Film Conversations podcast. In today's episode, we are very happy to welcome Mary Wilde to the show to talk about Alfred Hitchcock's 1958 masterpiece, Vertigo. So here's the Wikipedia synopsis of the film. Vertigo is a 1958 American psychological thriller film directed and produced by Alfred Hitchcock. The story was based on the 1954 novel D'entre les morts, From Among the Dead, by Boileau Narcejac. The screenplay was written by Alec Koppel and Samuel A. Taylor. The film stars James Stewart as former police detective John Scotty Ferguson, who has retired because an incident in the line of duty has caused him to develop acrophobia, an extreme fear of heights, and vertigo, a false sense of rotational movement. Scotty is hired by an acquaintance, Gavin Elster, as a private investigator to follow Gavin's wife, Madeline, Kim Novak, who is behaving strangely. The film was shot on location in the city of San Francisco, California, as well as in Mission San Juan Bautista, Big Basin Redwoods State Park, Cypress Point on 17 Mile Drive, and Paramount Studios in Hollywood. It is the first film to use the dolly zoom, an in-camera effect that distorts perspective to create disorientation, to convey Scotty's acrophobia. As a result of its use in this film, the effect is often referred to as the vertigo effect. In 1996, the film underwent a major restoration to create a new 70mm print and DTS soundtrack. On her Twitter page, I refuse to call that platform X, Mary describes herself as a Freudian cinephile and feminine jouissance maximalist, which is both a marvelous phrase and a fantastic declaration. Mary is the creator of the Projections lecture series at the Freud Museum, London, co-host of the Projections podcast, contributor to Evolution Pod, and the host of her own podcast on Freud, film, and related topics. I'm happy to say that I was a guest on Mary's podcast a few months ago to talk about how AI is treated as a topic in film. So a note about this episode, we originally recorded an episode with Mary on Vertigo on August 6th. Unfortunately, there was a technical problem that caused the loss of the entire recording, which is frustrating to put it mildly. Very kindly, Mary agreed to come on again to re-record. We're very glad and grateful that she did, not only because it gives us a chance to talk with Mary about Vertigo, but also because it gives us a chance to more fully explore her Freudian approach to the film, which I think you will find quite intriguing and hopefully illuminating as well. As always, there will be links to all the references in the show notes. This was a great conversation, which we looked forward to for some time, twice over. Vertigo is a brilliant film that rewards rewatching, and Mary is a brilliant person to walk us through it. I hope you enjoy. All right, so, hey everyone, this is Dwayne Monroe, one of the co-hosts along with R.C. Charles Roberts and Dennis Claxton of the Film Conversations podcast. And today we have with us, once again, I should say, our special guest, Mary Wilde. And as you heard in the intro to this show, we did a previous recording that experienced what soldiers in World War II, American soldiers, called a snafu, which stands for situation normal, all effed up. Some technical glitch which killed the recording. So Mary very kindly agreed to be on again. Now, last time when we recorded, we sort of walked our way to a Freudian analysis of vertigo, which of course is the topic of our recording. But this time I want to build on the argument that Mary presented us with in the previous recording that was lost. And I'll just start by saying that when I viewed Vertigo initially, my understanding of Vertigo was that Scotty was kind of a villain, because the focus was on his manipulation of the Madeline/Judy, or really Judy, into being his fantasy of Madeline. That was my understanding. But in our last conversation, you actually presented what I would consider to be a truly radically new interpretation of Scotty's role and of the film itself. And Charles had a response to that based upon his understanding of Sartre's view of human behavior. And it was a rather lively discussion. But
it was a lot of fun. It's going to be interesting to see how it goes now. Now that it's sort of been
marinated on.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, Mary, I would like to give you an opportunity to describe once again yourself and your work and whatever you think is important for our listeners to know about you.
Certainly. Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you.
I am someone who works in the domain of film and psychoanalysis. I run a lecture series called Projections at the Freud Museum in London, which centers Freudian psychoanalysis as a theoretical framework for approaching film interpretation. And that's been going on now for actually 11 years this month.
Yeah, wow.
We've been doing that partnership, which is exciting.
Yes.
I also co-host a podcast called Projections Podcast, which is named after my lecture series. I co-hosted with Sarah Cleaver, and it's a dialogue on film and psychoanalysis. We've several series uploaded already. We're currently in a hiatus because I'm writing a book. So I need some time to do that. But in the meantime, I'm still working on my solo project on Patreon, where effectively I'm still working through kind of the issues in psychoanalysis and cinema. And that's an ongoing project.
And if it's not prying, do you have a working title and a topic for your book to share?
Yes, I do. It's going to be called Psychoanalyzing Horror Cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be looking at 50 films within various subgenres of horror, very much from psychoanalytic perspective.
That's exciting.
Wow, 50 is a lot.
It is. That's quite ambitious.
Yes, it is. I mean, I've got my work cut out for me.
Bon chance. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah, I think it'll be quite interesting because modern horror, and I'm sure that you've examined this carefully, the jump scare phenomena, which is a degeneration, in my view, of what horror is supposed to be. As an exploration of our psyche in various ways, and often our psychosexual preoccupations, I believe. But yeah, I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
So, as I mentioned at the top, I would like to give you also an opportunity to start us off by giving us your interpretation of Vertigo overall from a Freudian perspective. And also, of course, the center of the movie is James Stewart's character of Scotty and his odyssey, so to speak, through this film.
Yes, that's right. So we see Scotty right away. I mean, this is how the film opens. He witnesses a fellow policeman falling to his death. And so out of this situation, out of this terrible, senseless tragedy of witnessing this death, he actually develops a phobia of heights, acrophobia, and vertigo. So because of these debilitating mental conditions, he has to retire. And he sort of tries to conquer his fear, but he doesn't quite get at it. And then over time, we see that an acquaintance of his, Gavin Elster, asks Scotty to follow his wife, Madeline, claiming that she's been having behaving strangely and her mental state is abnormal.
Mm-hmm.
So he's claiming that, there's something, it's almost like he's suggesting something paranormally wrong with her, even.
Yes.
Right at this very stage. And he does that. He follows her around San Francisco. We get these magnificent shots of, the city and him on her trail. We come to understand that the woman who's being presented as Madeline seems to be fixated on a figure from the past, Carlotta Valdez.
Yes.
And that there's, it's implied that there's almost this kind of haunting going on, because she reports that she even blacks out. She loses track of time. So it's all presented in this very mysterious way without going into too much detail. It turns out that this is actually all a murder plot, and they're trying to trick Scotty. And the sticking point is that he sort of staged and set up to follow whom he believes is Madeline up the stairs of a chapel tower. But he sort of led down that trail, but actually he cannot make it up there because of his acrophobia and his vertigo. He witnesses a woman falling from the tower. He assumes it's been Madeline. It's been a murder plot the whole time. Gavin Allister has actually set this up to make it look like, it was in fact Madeline who fell to her death. Well, it was in fact Madeline, but the woman that he was following was actually this woman, Judy.
Yes.
Long story short, I believe that the second half of the movie, effectively when Scotty re-encounters Judy, and he thinks, oh, she looks so very much like Madeline, he becomes fixated and obsessed with restaging that persona in her, kind of coercing her into taking on the entire Madeline look, the gray suit, the blonde hair, the same makeup.
The same style of hair.
The same style of hair, exactly. Very importantly, that same sort of, I guess, kind of updo with an interesting abyss-like feature in the hair.
It's a very 1950s sexy constraint, like the kind of the pencil skirt, the hairdo, the whole thing is a very 1950s presentation of like a very sexy yet chaste person. At least that's how I always interpret it. Like
absolutely.
The way that Madeline is presented.
I was going to say her hair. That's the last thing she kind of holds on to.
Yes,
she comes back from, he's in the hotel waiting for her. She comes back. She's wearing the gray suit and everything, but her hair is down.
Yes.
Yes.
She's trying to hold on to one last thing
of Judy.
Then he says, your hair.
It has to be the hair, because the staging and the recreation, the restaging of Madeline is absolutely paramount to achieve full excitement and passion in him. So my claim is that there's various things going on here. Gavin Allister and effectively Judy, who posed as Madeline, they are exploiting Scotty for his mental disturbance. They chose him specifically because he's afraid of heights, so that he wouldn't go all the way up the tower. That was, that neuroticism in him, that phobia was the key for the murder plot to be successful.
Yeah. You remember when he first met Gavin Elster? And Elster says, shouldn't you be sitting down?
Yeah.
And he mentions that he read in the paper what happened. So, Hitchcock lets you know that Elster knows.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Scotty was chosen specifically for this purpose because of his issues. And my reading of it is that what we get from Scotty is a very very classically Freudian neurotic figure. He's very much in this vice grip of neurosis. What I mean by that, not just because he's a phobic character, but because when we see that very first scene of him hanging over the edge of the building and he's just witnessed his colleague fall to his death, we understand, of course, that he was helped off the edge of the building.
Yes.
But we've not been shown the rescue. So there's no filmic cinematic register of him coming down from the edge, hanging suspended in the air like that. My reading of Vertigo is that ontologically, Scotty remains in that hanging in the balance position where he's in a kind of strange, like limbo state, experientially, ontologically, he's still in a purgatory with his emotions. He's still very much between life and death, which is a very neurotic condition, not fully living his life. He's now retired and he seems to just be going through the motions of life. He doesn't really have a love life to speak of. The fact that he sort of becomes entranced by this Madeline character who's seemingly, or at least presented as in and out of consciousness, blacking out, living in the past, obsessed with death. This is precisely what would excite and beguile a neurotic.
That's interesting.
I'm talking about like theoretically.
Yes.
These are people who are actually over preoccupied with the death drive. By the death drive, I mean, the opting out of the erotic, the opting out of the life force, actually being impotent, really impotent. The fact that he couldn't reach the top of the tower is not just hinting at his acrophobia and vertigo. I think that the chapel tower is that phallic object that he cannot reach the pinnacle of. Like, to be perfectly, honest, like to be frank about it, he just, he's not excited by life. And so his inability to reach the top is sort of underlining his impotence.
Well, and I think about the moment when he's in the bar or the lounge, when he first sees the Madeline character. So there he is. I mean, he's well put together visually. He's having a martini or what have you at the bar, but he's not. But everyone else, and it's interesting how this is shot. Everyone else is having a good time, but he is not, and he's alone. And then he sees the Madeline persona moving through, and of course he's mesmerized by this. Now there are other pretty women there, but it's a bit. It's interesting to me, like the way that he when he first actually is after being told about his assignment, so to speak, to actually be in the presence of this synthetic person.
Yes, absolutely. And this is what would attract him to her. It's that feature of her that, as you say, is already pre-staged. Like he's already told, it's already prescribed how she's going to be. And of course, Judy walks into that script and enacts the whole, scheme. But
I love that. I love the pause and the profile.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. And that profile is repeated,
yes, it is.
Throughout the movie.
And there's a difference between the way I've always read that, although, with your help, I'm seeing it in an even deeper way. But I read that as, well, yes, of course you would notice her. She's very attractive, but there's something different about the way that he's noticing her, which now that you mentioned this neurosis, takes my thoughts in different directions, because I'm thinking, well, if I was sitting at the bar and Kim Novak is walking by in a pencil skirt, well, of course I'd be like, oh, that's a very attractive person.
Of course.
But I don't think I'd like to think that I wouldn't be a creep about it.
So fixated.
Yes,
the fixation is actually a marker of his own preoccupation with death, which is the point of what Freud tells us about neurosis, because these are people who are, yes, alive technically, they have a pulse, but they are reluctant to fully immerse themselves in the whole kind of like uncertainty of life. They're very hesitant. They're just kind of existing just on the trenches, like on the sidelines And the fact that, when he does meet Judy later on, my reading of that whole sequence where he encounters Judy and she obviously reminds him of Madeline. She is in fact the same woman. My reading of it is that this sequence is not a real event. This sequence is happening very much for him psychically at an interior level, where he is returning to the past. And that is a tendency for neurosis, the repetition compulsion, visiting old ground, endlessly ruminating. Yes, that is a feature. But here, I think he's actually reprocessing. It's repeating and working through, repeating, remembering, and working through, which is incidentally is the name of an essay by Freud. This is where you actually get the crucial work done for understanding what is setting you back in terms of symptom, and working in a very focused way to reprocess the trauma, to remove the symptom, to actually eradicate it. And I think that, yes, of course it's tempting to look at Vertigo and say, this man, is a sadist. He's captured this woman emotionally. He's pressuring her to look like a previous girlfriend. This is all very warped. But I actually think that he's restaging the past, recreating every last detail that, yes, admittedly excites him as well. The death drive of Madeline is what launches his own libido, which is a very sad situation. And you wouldn't want that to be something to strive for. That's not an ideal thing. But crucially, it's when he pieces together that this Judy person was always impersonating Madeline. He figures this out when he sees her necklace, drags her back to the scene where the real Madeline died, drags her up the tower, the chapel tower, and he says, why did you pick on me? Like he's very focused about that. He understands finally that he was selected for the murder plot and he was exploited. It's only at that moment that he makes that connection that they were the real perpetrators and he was another victim alongside, the real Madeline, that the acrophobia, the fear of heights and vertigo disappear. It's the reworking of, there's a revisiting of the site of trauma, reprocessing the past that finally unlocks his libido again. And he can drag her all the way up to the tower, which means, that's a phallic symbol of life returning to him, his libido reinvested again. And sadly, Judy does fall off the tower, but not because of him, but because she's startled by the figure of a nun who approaches.
Which is
and
interesting.
I think this is more a signal of her own spiritual unease with her own role in the murder plot. That means that she falls to her death. It's sort of like a poetic justice. But ultimately, I read Vertigo as a positive resolution of a phobia, of what happens when you actually do restage your trauma with actually in the intention to reprocess, not just to repeat, mindlessly, but to actually re-examine, remember, work through, and reprocess. So I think it's working, a story.
Which I love this analysis. And what I'm curious about is your thoughts regarding why, at least in my reading and hearing about the movie over a number of years, this has been missed. In other words, Scotty is, of course, the subject of a ruse. And you know that factually as you view the movie. And yet, at least I, and I think others, overlook this to focus on him dragging Judy and him prior to that reshaping Judy. We focus on this and then declare Scotty, James Stewart's character, to be just a bad man. And I'm wondering what you think about this simplification of our thinking about this.
I think that it's actually really perfectly natural to reach that conclusion, because I think that is part of Hitchcock's red herring. It's part of Hitchcock's misdirection, purposeful misdirection to stage it so that we think that Scotty is, there's something, profoundly, like, ethically wrong with him.
Yes.
Because why is it that, for example, even with the figure of Midge, I think Midge works into this misdirection. She's sort of like a very clever tool for the red herring to work, because she's presented to us as someone sensible, someone who's actually interested in Scotty. It's not just some fantasy figure or some phantom or specter that haunts him. She's an actual woman, like a real prospect in front of him. And yet he chooses to look away from her.
Yes.
And yet, so it's like on the surface, it works in Midge's favor, and it upholds the theory that Scotty is not to be trusted. But I think that the red herring is exposed almost like in a flash, but it's absolutely essential when Midge shows Scotty a painting she did of herself dressed as Carlotta Valdez. And to me, it regrounds Vertigo for me as really like a hero's journey for Scotty, because I think that Midge is actually completely out of bounds to kind of mess with someone's fixation in that way and make it into a trite thing and an object of like kind of almost like gentle teasing and mockery, but nevertheless trivializing something that he's sort of really messed up about. He's really screwed up about this.
Yes.
And I think that on several levels, Hitchcock uses a misdirection and a red herring to constantly keep us in this haze of mystery. But if you follow the logic of Freudian psychoanalysis, I think it's absolutely clear. The path of the hero's journey is very, very sharp for me. I can see it.
Hey, Mary, I have a question for you. You're saying red herring. Have you heard the term MacGuffin?
Yes.
So it's a MacGuffin, right?
Yes.
What, the entire script?
I think it is. I really think it is. And I think that it's so infuriating because it could very well also work as purely a reading of Scott being a bad man.
Yes.
Except for the fact that his phobias were cured. That is the sticking point. The fact that his phobias were cured and he was relaunched into action. He was relaunched into libidinal self-investment and no longer the man hanging off the side of the building, no longer in limbo, no longer in psychic purgatory. That is the sticking point in the theory that he's purely a bad man and he's a sadist. I think, the setup of the film, even the topographical structure of the film.
Yes.
Yeah, he's hanging out in the beginning. He's hanging off the edge of a building. In the end, he's standing at the edge of a building.
Standing tall.
That's quite interesting. And Midge, speaking of misdirection, of course, I mean, we are told by Hitchcock, we are told by the script that, as you say, Midge is the sensible choice. What's wrong with you, Scotty? You madman. Why don't you just settle down with this lovely, intelligent person? But you're absolutely right that the painting, and even during like my first viewing, that painting struck me as, well, that's actually really pretty nasty. This man is clearly having a hard time, whether you think it's worthwhile or not, or whether you think he's mistaken, but he's having some sort of difficulty. And then to do that is just kind of, it's a disregard. And also, I would think, now that I'm more mature, I would think it kind of disqualifies her as a good partner, right? Because what else would Midge do if you were to, say, marry her?
Yeah, she's showing us what she's really capable of. It's not just that she recreated the Carlotta Valdez painting. She supplanted herself.
Yes.
In the nightmare scenario, in the thing that is, causing him sleepless nights and like this kind of dark nights of the soul. She's supplanting herself in the very thing that terrifies him, that's really touched a nerve. Yes. And I think that is major red flags. I don't trust Midge at all.
That was there's a lot of doubling with mirrors and stuff. But when he looks at the painting, and then he looks at her. So she's sitting next to the painting. So the two of them are right there. It's pretty spooky.
Oh, yeah. It's very spooky.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Even from my first viewing when I was much younger, that particular section of the movie just really hit me in a very different way. And as I said, it made me think, well, she's not that nice after all.
No.
This is not a particularly nice person. Now, I know that Charles has some things he'd like to say, but before we get to Charles, Dennis, I know that you've also gathered some notes and have some questions for Mary, so I'll give you an opportunity to take the floor for that.
Well, this time I don't have as many notes as usual because I have seen Vertigo so many times. And so I could talk about it. I think I told you I could talk about it in my sleep. So they're just about the movie itself. Some things that I like is the pace of, you think of another San Francisco movie called Bullet with Steve McQueen.
Mm-hmm.
Which has one of the most famous car chase scenes,
Mm-hmm.
And then you compare that car chase and, driving the streets of San Francisco with Scotty following Madeline.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so languid. It's just, I just love how slow it is.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I do have some notes. One, I have Judy from Salina, Kansas, which I love Salina. That's great. She says to him at one time, well, when they first meet, when he knocks on the hotel door, and she's telling, she's saying, go away, go away. And then, he's so insistent, and so he looks so forlorn. And, of course, she knows who he is. But anyway, she says, you don't look like Jack the Ripper. So have you guys seen a film called The Lodger?
I have not.
It's Hitchcock's first big hit. It's a silent movie. And it's based on a Jack the Ripper type story. And again, MacGuffin, red herring. You think one person is the killer, and it turns out he's looking for the killer.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I just thought, you don't look like Jack the Ripper. Hitchcock is the kind of person, he talked a lot about his movies. Like, there's a famous a book full of interviews with Truffaut talking to Hitchcock. But I also get the sense that if you sat down and ask Hitchcock some of the questions that we're talking about, he would be like John Ford, and he'd be like, what are you talking about? No, that's not, I wasn't thinking that at all,
Well, but many directors and creative people are like that, and sometimes they're telling you the truth because, as I'm sure Mary, you would probably be able to instruct us. I mean, things are just coming from the psyche, right? That you may or may not be aware of. Certainly, when I write, for example, there are things that come out at times that I refine it later, but I was like, oh, that's a metaphor, a simile, or something that where'd that come from? I don't know. But then other times, and I think this is true of John Ford, I think they're just lying because Ford was trying to present himself as this tough guy who, I could be slinging, hash in a diner, or I could be, a roughneck on an oil rig. I just happen to be making movies. Like, well, that's a quite different profession, and it does, have a different set of requirements. And preoccupations, right? So it's kind of odd for someone to insist that they had literally no idea of what they were doing, which Ford was famous for doing. But Hitchcock, actually, Mary, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think how Hitchcock would respond?
Well, I think in the case of Hitchcock, because we know that Hitchcock was very consciously reading psychoanalysis. He was interested in Freud. There are several films of his where you can see clearly that psychoanalytic concepts are being referred to in a deliberate way. The theoretical framework is undeniable. I'm thinking of Spellbound. I'm thinking of Psycho. And Marnie, to name just a few. I mean, you could say that about The Birds as well.
Yes.
And Rear Window, to a certain extent. But I think that given that he, I don't know whether he was deliberately trying to present Scotty as a man who's coming from this philosophical place of having neurosis and meeting life in this very hesitant, very reserved, very retreating way, very self-punitive way. And that the whole thing, the entire movie is actually just structured for him to have a breakthrough moment and finally be rid of his phobia. I do not know whether he intended for that to be done deliberately, but I can't help but think that because he was reading so much Freud, that the original story of Vertigo appealed to him at that level. And that he might have ended up, just by virtue of the various forces of this story, ended up kind of proving Freud's point. And that's
just how it works when you create, right? I mean, I consider myself to be a dialectician.
Sure.
And a person who takes the idea of historical materialism very seriously. And so every time I'm thinking about something or writing about something, I'm trying to see the factors in play in relation to each other, right? Now, I say that to say that whether or not I'm always conscious of that, I think it comes through when I write and when I respond to people, because they'll say, here's the one thing that's true. And I'll say, but what about the 30 other things that are playing with each other that you're not talking about? And so for Hitchcock, having studied, as you say, Freud, and done so, I'm taken to believe, like, rather seriously, not as a scholar, but as a person who certainly has studied, that it would be inevitable that these ideas, whether conscious or not, these structures would come through in his cinema to greater or lesser extent, depending upon the script and the story that he's trying to tell.
Yes.
Well, I remember last time we were talking about Hitchcock was born in 1899, and Mary, you said that there's some famous essay by Freud that was written that year.
Yes, it's actually the book Interpretation of Dreams, which Freud meant to be published. He was meant to publish it the year 1899, but then he told his publisher to change the publication date to 1900 because he said, the next century belongs to me.
Charles may or may not agree. Charles, you're on mute, so unmute yourself. And there we have it.
All right. I'll start off by saying that this is not the first time that Freud, Sartre, and cinema all met. There was a film that, what's his name? John Huston was trying to
John Huston.
Huston. And he went to Sartre because Sartre told him he was interested in writing about it or for it or a script or something like that. And they ended up hating each other because Sartre is very verbose and wrote a very long script, and he was late constantly.
Of course, he
deadlines. Although if John had wanted to know that, he could have just asked Sartre's publisher.
But wait, so he asked a philosopher to write a script?
Yes, he did, and he apparently expected the philosopher to write like a screenplay. And so eventually they ended up meeting, and John was being all outrageous, trying to get under Sartre's skin, and Sartre just wasn't interested. He was like, "Here's the script." The guy's like, "It's too long." He's like, "Well, I'm not." So it never happened. That said, for the movie Vertigo, I kind of want to start with the idea of vertigo in and of itself, because Sartre writes about it being in nothingness. And the way I see the movie Vertigo on the ground level for me is that it's a story of somebody who, having experienced mistrust both of the world and with their body, which is what for Sartre is, attempts to reunite the world and himself at the end. And Sartre would call it trying to be God, but that's a whole other thing. I'll get to that.
Yeah, and by God, you're referring to the ability to the attempt to control your environment.
The ability to be both constant and
interesting.
To be consistently oneself, but also be free. And which Sartre points out is impossible. But to start with Vertigo, and being in nothingness, Sartre uses the image of walking along. And he points out that when you're walking along the cliff, you don't necessarily have a fear of falling off, because what it is it's not fear, it's anguish. And the reason it's anguish is not only is there the possibility that you could step and fall, there's a possibility that you could let yourself fall or jump. And for Sartre, the what's highlighted in Vertigo, and I think it's highlighted from the beginning with Scotty, is that the world doesn't conform to the way you want it to. It's part of the contingency. But your own body doesn't necessarily adhere to what you want either. Because Sartre was very big on the fact that intentions don't matter. They don't determine things necessarily. Sometimes you can consistently intend for something to happen, and it will, but it's not because of the intention. The world very often, as he puts it, erupts in whatever you're doing, whatever your plan is, whatever your plan is, and gets in the way. You could be running to jump a fence, and you may be completely confident that you can jump that fence, but maybe you try to jump and your shirt gets caught, or maybe you jump and you're just not as strong as you thought you were. So the world and your own body can often be mistrusted, and that's radical. And so for Sartre, in my interpretation, is basically Scotty has a run-in with a sense of radical freedom, even though it's radical freedom to, almost die. But he has a run-in with Vertigo. That's how it begins. And as Scotty goes, Scotty is attempting to reestablish trust both in the world and himself. And I would argue, kind of from a Sartrean perspective, that's why he takes the job out. Is for Sartre, often we pick projects because in the end, our actions and our choices give us something that unites us with the internal aspect of ourselves and the reality, unites it. You make an act, both things are gone. And so I feel like that's the reason Scotty takes the job. And ultimately, I refrained from any kind of moralistic readings of Vertigo, because for me, I don't think there are any heroes.
Yeah.
I think there are people. And they're people put into situations where their freedom is thrust into their face, and some of them, they all don't, they all react in their own way. But Sartre argued that relationships are sadomasochistic by nature. And it's not that one person is always in control and the other person isn't. It's that there's an instability, and so somebody tries to take control, or as he says, tries to possess somebody else's freedom, and the other person either submits or they try to do it. And it's kind of back.
So for Sartre, there's always a struggle within every type of relationship, and that's a natural aspect of being in relation.
Right. later on, he kind of tries to go Hegel's route of saying that the only way out of it is recognition, which I don't think even he believed. Unfortunately, he made a pretty solid case for relationships being sadomasochistic. But so after Scotty takes the job and he starts, dealing with Madeline. For me, the way I read it is that it changes from him following to him trying to control. And it's not trying to control her in the sense of he's being mean to her. It's that she's the project, she's the goal in that situation. And it gives him the unity that he wants, even if it's a false one. Because, as Sartre argues, the ego is imaginary. It's something that we impose on ourselves when we reflect on how we live. And I think that for Scotty, his role of, following Madeline, and then when he gets involved with Madeline, it's part of his attempt to reassert an ego that unites, unites the fragmented aspects of his mistrust with the world and his mistrust with himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so he focuses on Madeline in that way. And she is, as Madeline, she is sort of the perfect object in the sense that she's playing a part. And so what he's trying to grasp and control and trying to love is not a real thing. It's an action. And so ultimately, that scene with the trees, which I found interesting in the forest, I found interesting because I made a parallel to in my head to Sartre's Nausea, where he confronts the oak.
And Dennis, what is pardon me, Charles, what is the name of that forest in California?
I can never pronounce it. It's a famous sort of naturalist guy.
Yes, and I think
Muir Woods. It's kind of a museum for trees.
Wow, yeah, and the reason I pause here is that the trees are quite ancient, which I think is an important aspect of that scene. Well, actually, a critical aspect of that scene. Like, it's not just a lovely park. It's like you're surrounded by kind of like a really primal nature.
Right. Exactly. Well, they start talking about.
There's that scene where they look at the cross section.
Exactly.
Right.
And also the cross section is almost in the shape of a spiral as well. Like there's several circles, that expand, marking the age of the tree. But I think it plays on the nice motif of spirals throughout the movie.
Right. And but when they're in the forest, they also start talking about, if I remember correctly, their mentality. I forget exactly what was said, but it's an interesting kind of existential moment because you see Scotty go from trying to control Madeline to kind of trying to submit to what he believes is love. And Sartre actually calls this, in his psychoanalysis, he calls this the serious mode of being, where one ends up ultimately sacrificing their perception of the world or what they think to what they believe is reality. It's not always actually reality. And, he kind of attempts to change the dynamic because he wants to be possessed by her. Now that he's been going around kind of possessing her, he wants her to return the possession. But ultimately, after that, that's when she fakes her death. And the reason that scene is interesting to me is because his vertigo and his fear of heights, they reassert themselves. Basically, the unity, the imaginary ego he sets up with her through his idea of love gets shattered because basically it's bad faith. And for Sartre, what bad faith is the idea that one is either an object that can't do anything, or that they're completely free and they can do whatever they want. And it's kind of a lie that's used to compensate with our freedom to deal with reality, not to overcome reality as much as deal with it. Because a lot of people read Sartre as believing we have free will, and they should not read it that way at all. In fact, he praises Spinoza being a nothingness and rejects free will after developing 3 different arguments for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for him, freedom is about dealing with it. It's about, handling that. And for example, for Sartre, emotions are naturally felt things, but they tend to be gestures, for him, gestures of uselessness, in the sense that, you get angry or you get sad, or, you even get happy because it's an attempt to avoid kind of the way it works. And so for Scotty, he develops bad faith based on this idea of love. And it gets shattered when he can't go all the way up the tower. He hasn't unified the aspects of his life. Or he tried to, and it was under an imaginary ego. And so that's the first part of the film is basically, to me, is sort of this battle with it's kind of this setup of a false, it's a setup of bad faith that ends up not working, and it ends up being shattered because he can't really overcome the vertigo he's feeling.
Well, let me ask you this: doesn't that align? That kind of aligns with what Mary has been saying?
I don't think Sartre and Freud are that different.
I wanted to ask you just kind of directly: how come Sartre didn't like? Disagreed. What's the basic? I mean, I don't want to make you say it in one sentence, but what's the basic sort of disagreement?
So there are a few. For example, Sartre doesn't think that the ego is actually a thing. He doesn't think that there's any sort of reality to the ego. He thinks it's just a way we situate ourselves in the past and try to come to understand ourselves. And you can sort of understand yourself, but it's always indirect. There's no direct relationship. And I also haven't read a lot of Freud, so I might be wrong on these disagreements, but this is my understanding. The second
and of course, the disagreements will be based upon Sartre's perspective. Yes.
Yes, because he might be wrong. For example, he has an argument about repression that doesn't make sense. He says that if somebody represses memories, that they have to be consciously repressing them. They're repressing them to an unconscious. Therefore, you can't consciously repress something to an unconscious. It's a messed up. It doesn't make sense. But the other disagreement, at least main disagreement, I should say, is that Sartre doesn't think there's a such thing as an unconscious. He doesn't think that exists. He believes that we have an unreflective consciousness, which is basically when we live our lives sort of, I don't want to say autopilot, but we kind of live in relation to whatever instincts are going on, or we're minimally conscious of what we're doing. Not minimally conscious. He thinks we're always conscious, but we're just not focusing on it. It's like when you bite your nails, or when you when you get into a flow when you're writing and you're not focused on having to evolve. You're just kind of focused on what you're doing without reflecting on yourself. And for him, that's what we have instead of an unconscious. He doesn't think there's an unconscious that rears its head. He just thinks that there's a unreflective consciousness, which our reflective consciousness is always trying to capture and understand. objectify into a certain way, because bad faith is a reflect. It's an attempt to.
So for Sartre, Scotty would, because you mentioned earlier that he took the assignment from Elster. I suppose that Sartre would say consciously, in order to not fix himself, but to address a lack, that this something for me to focus on, that he wasn't, say, drifting towards it unconsciously, for Sartre, that he would be selecting it, whether he would tell you that over drinks or not, like clearly.
Right. What Sartre would say is that we often will do things and we consciously know why we're doing them, but we pick a preferred lie or excuse, because for Sartre, motivations don't come first; they come second. They come afterwards. And so, if you had asked Scotty, for example, why did you take this job, he'd probably say something like, "Well, I kind of need the work; it gives me something." Now, is that true? I don't think so. I think he took it because he was looking for something to kind of bring his kind of impose his ego on himself and try to unify his life so it's not so uncertain. But he would pick whatever, that's what bad faith sort of is, in a very simplified way, is often picking excuses. It's kind of like there's just a lot of different examples of how that works.
In the time we have remaining, what I'd like you to do, actually, and I'd like, Mary, for you to give your thoughts on this. I'm really fascinated, Charles, by the idea of the sadomasochistic aspect of the relationship. Well, Sartre's idea in general, but applying that to this particular relationship as depicted in the movie, that intrigues me, because I could see it as being kind of a kind of duality of sadomasochism. I think that some people, that Sartre would say, yes, of course, it's a mutual thing. In the way that David Lynch might understand in the way he presented, what was the movie? Twin Peaks had this aspect, but Mary, I'm sure you would know, not Lost Highway, but there's a Lynch movie in which the sadomasochistic element of a relationship is front and center.
Blue Velvet?
Blue Velvet, yes, indeed. So, so Charles, I'd like you to focus on that for a little bit, and then Mary, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well.
So, for Sartre, the sadomasochism, at least that would be in this film, would be Scotty trying to possess Madeline, and then again trying to possess her when she's cheating. And the first time, Madeline is something she's pretending to be, and so it's a fruitless kind of attempt to possess them, because he's not possessing an actual person; he's possessing something from the role. But with Judy, you get to the point where she says, I don't remember the quote anymore, but she says basically something like, if I change my hair, will you love me?
Yes, essentially, yes.
Yeah, and then then he responds, affirmatively, and she says something like, I don't care what happens to me, or something, which is for Sartre, that's the masochistic aspect of the relationship coming out. For Judy, where she completely she wants to be loved by Scotty to the point where she's willing to kind of surrender the ability to possess her own identity. And actually, when Mary talks about neurosis, I don't necessarily see that in Scotty from a Sartre perspective. It's well documented from a Freudian perspective, but for Sartre, and I'm going to bring a little R.D. Laing in, it's more.
It's always a good time for Laing in my book,
right? And for the movie, Judy is the one, at least when she's being Judy, who's neurotic. And the reason is for R.D. Laing, he described neurosis as the acceptance of non-being in order to avoid the loss. And so, in a sense, Judy is trying to remain somebody he loves, and so she accepts a sort of non-being where she will do whatever he wants and change her hair and change how she looks and all of that in order to maintain being somebody that he loves, even though it's an acceptance of non-being to avoid the loss.
Interesting.
And so it seems that Judy to me is more the neurotic character. But all this culminates, of course, for me. I think it's a story that's about it's a combination of bad faith, escapism, which ultimately becomes empathy in the end, because all the dreams and the I want to say the hallucinations that he goes through and all of that. A Sartrean reading of that would be that he's kind of trying to escape the reality that he's trying to face, because at that point, he's coming to terms with, in my opinion, I think he's working through the fact at the time that he was being played. He doesn't know it, but he's working through it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's for Sartre, when you get to that point of realizing something like that, manipulated using your own mental issues, it's a hard reality to take, and so the hallucinations are bits of escapism, kind of delving into things that may or may not be real, as a way to escape. But he ultimately confronts it, or he tries to, and the thing about for Sartre is that I don't think the vertigo is technically cured. I think his fear of heights is cured. But from a Sartre perspective, his vertigo technically stays where it is, in the sense that when he repeats it, and he takes her all the way up, and she still falls, even though she was scared by a nun. It's not like he directly caused it. But that nun
this is a time when I wish we were still doing video, because the look on Mary's face right now.
Yes, Mary does disagree, which is fine.
Fine. And so, but basically, when the nun comes out and startles Judy, that's a reasserting that he can't trust the world. Even though he overcomes his fear of heights, it's nothing's gained. The same thing happens, maybe to a different person, but the same thing is done, and somebody still dies.
And this gets to Charles. You and I have talked about this many times, that Sartre, I think, doesn't actually believe in progress of any sort.
He thinks that people change very rarely, if at all, and it's because they don't want to. And it's basically the idea is that we are often changed by things beyond ourselves. Sartre doesn't have a very strong opinion on the will. He doesn't think it's very powerful. He's not like Nietzsche and the will to power. In fact, Simone, I never say her last name right, but she mentioned that the will to power. Yeah. I won't even attempt. But she mentioned that there is no will to power in her mind because everything's too weak. And I think that's kind of the Sartrean position, is that we have the freedom, but the will is weak. And the will, in and of itself, he thinks that voluntary acts are lies. And it's an attempt to try to either establish an imaginary ego, or it's an attempt to do a new project with bad faith. It's just very hard to change people, and it usually comes from the outside. And
you know what? I think we should get Mary in here.
Because
forget what she was thinking.
Because we will have a conversation about that, I think, in greater detail, even outside of Vertigo. But yes, Mary, I now turn the mic over to you.
Yes, thank you. There's a lot of what you said, Charles, that I do agree with, actually, but I have to fundamentally part ways with you on the issue of who is actually being the sadist and who's the masochist in Vertigo. I think, yes, there is sadomasochism in Vertigo, but ultimately it is Gavin Elster and Judy who come up with a murder plot, and they very sadistically, it's important to underline this, very sadistically, actually single out Scotty as an accessory to murder, but precisely because of the phobia that he has. That is what facilitates the death of the real Madeline. So he is actually the one who is receiving that sadism from them. They played God. They're the ones who came up with the script and came up with this murder plan.
Well, there can be more than one sadist. I'm not saying that.
Of course. But what I'm saying is that when we see Scotty encountering Judy in the second half, refashioning her very deliberately to look like Madeline, I don't believe that's done because he's a sadist. I maintain that he's doing that on an allegorical level to revisit the scene of the trauma and restage the very thing that compelled him to become involved. His own fascination with Madeline, his own fascination with her, because she was presented to him as a haunted figure. The fact that she was a haunted figure was attractive to him precisely because he himself is a haunted figure. He is a neurotic. He is someone who is obsessed with death, living in the past, compelled to repeat the past, is in some kind of limbo state, constantly like hanging off the edge of his life ontologically. He's not a full participant. He's not fully leaning into the erotic, dimension, the libidinal potential of his life. That's what he finds attractive about her. That's what he gets off of, the haunted element. So he refashions Judy into his ghost, into his beautiful ghost, not because he's trying to hurt Judy, but because he still remains in that haunted state. It's only when he figures out that Judy was, one of the sadists who came up with a murder plot and had a hand in corrupting Scotty that way. It's only when he sees that necklace that he pieces everything together, and he's able to solve the mystery. After all, he is a detective.
Yeah.
Well, I think. Can
I just finish this thought, and then I'll pass it on to you. I think that the fact that he sees Judy wearing that necklace, that looks very much like the necklace that belonged to Carlotta Valdez. Mm-hmm. This is a repetition of the scene with Midge, where Midge supplants herself in the painting, making herself look like Carlotta Valdez. It's a repetition of seeing someone actually complicit in a plot, and actually seeing the red flag in the relationship, figuring out that he was the one who was played. He was their little toy. He internalized their game and became a sadist to himself. I believe he's only ever been a sadist to himself. He's not trying to hurt anybody else. Mm. He's always in a condition of opting out of life, ejecting himself from the life force, always remaining in the death drive. And that final scene when Judy falls off, he didn't push her off. He's not, it's not fair to say that his acrophobia was cured, but his vertigo is not, because we know his vertigo was cured. He looked down and he didn't see a spiral. Mm. He was fully embodied and got past his phobia. The nun thing, yes, of course that somebody else ended up dead. And uncannily the same exact way. So it was a total repetition of the past. But that's more to do with Judy. That's Judy's lot in life. And the nun appearing and startling her, I read that as her own spiritual crisis. And, that's how I see it. Sorry.
You're good. A few things. One, when I say that Scotty's being a sadist, it's not saying that he wants to hurt Judy or Madeline.
Okay.
It is a sadism to it's a sadism, in my opinion, in the project of trying to impress an ego upon himself. So it could be a sadism on himself. It's just enacted on somebody else. Sartre was a big proponent of the idea that often what we do to other people is something we're trying to do to ourselves. As far as the curing the vertigo and everything, the problem I have with an existential interpretation is that I'm going against the cinematic logic of the movie.
I see.
Because Hitchcock is, in fact, a Freudian. So for you are correct within the cinematic logic. The vertigo is fixed and everything like that. But my suggestion is that it wouldn't, in the sense that I think the vertigo is anguish, and for Sartre, anguish is a part of freedom. It's a part of radical freedom, having to deal with. And so ultimately, that radical freedom would rise up again, especially when he was up there. And it's not because he was hoping to push Judy off or anything like that. The radical freedom reasserts itself because of the nun. The nun coming out and causing a random event that he couldn't control and he didn't foresee, but somehow was the same as the event that happened before. It's just that's the vertigo. That's the anguish coming. Now Hitchcock, sets it as a cure, but Sartre would probably argue different.
And that's interesting because what I'm hearing from Mary is that, to put it in really direct and simple terms, for the Freudian view is that it is the information, it is the truth that has enabled Scotty to work things through. That is to say, if in his role as a detective, he had not been able to get to the bottom of things, then he would still be trapped.
Exactly.
But he was able to get to the bottom of things, and that information and his ability to process that information intelligently then gave him the tools to be able to work through. But that, Charles, what you're saying is that extra cinematically, that's the logic of the film, which is Freudian, as Mary has argued. But that outside of the logic of the film itself, and I'm sure that right now Hitchcock's ghost is about to say, it's pure cinema, what's going on here? That the logic of, outside the logic of the film, that there would be no freedom for Scotty because he would simply return, even if there was a momentary break, that perhaps he would return to these patterns that afflict him and indeed afflict all of us. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, although he would probably say that it's because of the freedom reasserting itself that he, the vertigo will come back to anguish. So it's not that he's not free. The problem is for what a lot of people don't understand with Sartre is being free is not. Being free is the starting place. We're condemned to be free. The point is to make choices. And Scotty has, in the movie, in my opinion, has been using other people and other events to give his ego some kind of unity. And then when he gets to the end and he loses Judy because of the nun, and he's there, he's without that crutch again. And so he's back to the radical freedom, but the ego that he tried to unify, which is why I consider it a movie of impotence, is that the ego he tried to create and unify is gone. Because it was entirely based on, his relationship to Judy and eventually revealing that the whole thing was a plot. Once that's gone, he has to go find something else, or Sartre would say that he would have to find a way to deal with the metastability.
Now, we've kept Mary for over an hour. And I want to be respectful of her time. Dennis, I know there's a question that you wanted to ask. I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask that before we bid everyone adieu.
Oh, you mean a minute ago?
Yeah.
I was just going to say that he doesn't recognize the necklace until he sees it in the mirror.
Yes, that's actually a very good point.
Yes, I think that's... Yeah.
Dennis, you come in from in the in the fourth quarter, and we're like, oh, that was quite a throw.
No, but you have a point, because it's like it's the reflection of the thing.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
That's it.
Yeah. That's actually quite remarkable. Well, everyone, thank you so much, Mary, for granting us once again your time. And thank you also to my co-hosts, Charles and Dennis. As always, it's a pleasure to work with you, fine gentlemen. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed. And of course, like and leave comments and do all these lovely things. So till next time, I'm Dwayne Monroe, bidding everyone farewell for Film Conversations. Bye-bye.